He came down with them, stood on a level place with a great crowd of his disciples and a great multitude of people from all Judea. One thing Jesus was obviously able to do was to draw large crowds. People were drawn to him. They were attracted. They were fascinated by him. Whether it was because of some personal need they had that they thought Jesus might somehow meet, or have an answer, or simply out of curiosity, or because they wanted to question him or argue with him. Wherever Jesus went, he had an audience. As we read through the gospel stories, it becomes clear that some who heard believed what he said, accepted what he said, accepted who he was, became his disciples. In the parlance of today, you might say that they became Jesus groupies. They helped spread the word about him. They brought others to him. Others were incensed by what they heard. They accused Jesus of blasphemy. They also enlisted others, but in this case, it was a campaign to get rid of him. But between these two polarities, those who loved and affirmed him and those who hated him, there must have been many other people who were simply intrigued by Jesus, maybe even attracted to him, but for whom he just wasn't making sense. They'd go out to the mountain or the level place or wherever it was that he was speaking. They'd listen to what he had to say, and maybe they'd go back the next day and the day after that, but they'd come away shaking their heads saying, "This is a strange teaching. What is it he's trying to tell us?" Jesus himself was obviously frustrated by that. It's amazing to me how many times in the Gospels we hear him saying things like this, and this is all quotes from the Gospels. Though seeing, they do not see. Though hearing, they do not hear or understand. That's Jesus saying that. Do you still not understand? How is it you don't understand? Oh, believing generation, how long shall I stay with you? How long shall I put up with you? Do you still not see or understand? Are your hearts hardened? That's Jesus saying that. Even his disciples, those who were closest to him, were often baffled by his pronouncements. With some regularity, the gospel writers throw in comments like this. They did not understand what he was saying to them. They did not understand what this meant. They did not grasp it. They did not understand what he meant and were afraid to ask him about it. The disciples did not understand any of this. They did not know what he was talking about. Jesus used this figure of speech, but they did not understand what he was telling them. Some of his disciples said, "What does he mean? We don't understand what he's saying." You see, you get that over and over and over. And I'm guessing that one of the times Jesus got that baffled response was when he laid out these declarations which we know as the Beatitudes. And now, Jesus didn't call them Beatitudes. That's from the Latin word for blessed, which is what they were. Were statements of blessing. Blessed are you who are poor. Blessed are you who hunger. Blessed are you who weep. Blessed are you who are hated because of me. In the Greek, the word is makarios, which can not only be translated blessed, but also happy or fortunate. So the mood of these sayings is affirmative. It's celebrative. Instead of saying blessed, you could just as well say how fortunate you are. how fortunate you are to be poor, to be hungry, to be weeping. But no matter what word you use, it doesn't change the incongruity of what Jesus is saying. Blessed or happy or fortunate. On the face of it, this is a perplexing prescription for well-being. You're going to be made happy by being poor? You have the good fortune to be hungry? You're going to be blessed because of your weeping? You have the advantage of being hated for my sake? I don't think so, is the logical response. And yet that's what Jesus seems to be saying. It appears that even the gospel writer Matthew had some trouble with that. So in Matthew's gospel, he also has a list of beatitudes or blesseds, and it's actually twice as long as what Luke has, but it's with a bit of a different spin. It's at the beginning of chapter 5 in Matthew, what we know as the Sermon on the Mount. And that's the list that many of us are more familiar with, maybe in part because it's a little easier to handle. Where Luke, for example, seems to be talking about our physical circumstances, our very literally being poor and hungry, Matthew spiritualizes it. In his gospel, the blessed are not the poor, but the poor in spirit. And not those who are hungry, but those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. This morning, though, partly because it's the lectionary text for today, I want to stick with Luke's list and focus on one of those blesseds in particular, the very first one. Blessed are you who are poor, for yours is the kingdom of God. Another way to put that is to say, if you're poor, you're living according to God's plan. Now, does that mean that if you have lots of money, or if you've got more than the bare minimum of material goods, you're out of God's loop and you're not going to be blessed? Well, as a pastor, I might be tempted to tell you that just so you'd part with more of your wealth and put it in the offering plate. But this isn't a stewardship sermon. And I've come to the conclusion that what Jesus is talking about here has only partially to do with material wealth. He's not really saying it's a blessing to be broke. He's not telling us, at least not here, that we have to give away everything in order to get to heaven. What Jesus is telling us, though, in its own way may be just as challenging. And it's not what we might first assume. So I'm saying we need to really delve into this and hear the message that Jesus is giving here for what it truly is. So let's pause for another language lesson. We get quite a different slant on this particular beatitude when we go back to the language Luke used when he was writing it, which was what is called Koine Greek. In those days there was classical Greek, which was the highfalutin literature, and there was Koine Greek, which is what the common people spoke in the street. And that's what this beatitude was first expressed in. In Greek, the word translated into our Bibles as poor is pachoi. Now, a more literal translation of pachoi would be those who are dependent upon others for support. In other words, beggars. While you and I may most often think about beggars as being destitute people asking for money, standing at the freeway off-ramp and begging there, And while that meaning certainly can be included here, the broader meaning of the word pchoi goes beyond that. It refers to those who are needy or dependent in any regard and are also willing to admit that they are in need so that they can ask for and receive help. Let me say that again. It refers to people who are needy or dependent in any sense and who are also willing to admit that they're in need so that they can ask for help. Now, first and foremost here, I'm sure that Jesus is saying something to us about our reliance upon God. He's reminding us that God is our helper. God is our provider. God is the primary source of blessing in our lives. And so he's saying, don't be too stubborn or too proud or too ignorant to lean on God and let God do for you what God can and wants to do. But I think he's steering us beyond that to one of the primary ways in which God works in our lives to meet our needs. And that's through our dependence upon one another. From that perspective, we can go back and read this first beatitude, something like this. Blessed, happy, fortunate are those people who know they need help and are willing to beg God and other people to give it to them. Now, I may be wrong, but I'm guessing I'm not the only one here who has a bit of a problem with the second part of that. At least in theory, it's okay to ask for help from God. Although I have to admit that in practice, I sometimes forget to do that. Act as if I can get along without God. But that's another issue. The point I want to make here is that I have a problem when you tell me that God's going to bless me by using you. And the only way I'm going to get that blessing is by calling you and asking you to do something for me. Don't tell me that I can't take care of things myself, or that I have to endure the embarrassment, the discomfort of saying I need you, that I have to risk being vulnerable. That's hard for me personally. It may not be for any of you, but it is for me. It goes against the grain of my self-sufficiency. It's asking me to do something I'm not inclined to do. But that's what Jesus is saying here. And as difficult as it often has been and still is for me to apply that bit of good news in my life, I do know from my own experience how right he is. The rewards of being among the pachoi of the world are incomparable. As I reflect back, I think the first time that what Jesus is teaching us in this beatitude really hit home for me was when my son Eric was born. I don't know that any of you have actually met Eric. Without going into a lot of detail, I'll just say that though he still lives in a care facility down in El Cajon and is into his 50s now, he lives with multiple disabilities. And the fact that he is alive at all today and still functioning at all is actually the result of an amazing series of miracles. He came into this world when I was serving as pastor of a church in Lemon Grove near San Diego. And when he was a couple of days old and not expected to live, in fact, it seemed like every Saturday night we got a call saying, come to the hospital quick, he's not going to make it. And I don't know why it was always Saturday night when I had to get up Sunday morning, but it became a part of our routine. But on the first time that happened, on this first Sunday after he was born, I stood before that congregation and started telling them what it was that was happening. And to understand my struggle at that point, you need to know that I saw myself as being extremely self-sufficient. Something I still struggle with, but especially then I did. And ironically, I wasn't an advocate of self-sufficiency for anybody else. In fact, from the time I was in high school, I was the one that people came to with their problems. That was my role, and I kind of reveled in that role. And when I became a pastor, I took it on professionally. The problem was that the more I did for others, the more I seemed to think that I had to be strong, self-reliant, always in control. And one outward manifestation of that is that I seldom cried at all. And as far as I know, I had never cried in front of another person. At least not as an adult. But when I started telling the congregation about Eric, I began to cry. And that wasn't just in front of another person, it was in front of over 300 people. And suddenly I was surrounded. It was as if this giant hand just lifted people out of the pews, and they came up in the area around here and just surrounded me, praying for me, praying for him. And at this point, I have no idea what I said after that. But I'll never forget that sacred moment. And to be honest, it took me a while to realize just how sacred it was. My tears embarrassed me. The almsgiver was suddenly the beggar. And I wasn't prepared to handle that. But here's what helped. I began to hear from person after person in the days and weeks that followed comments like this. We've always respected your professional abilities, but now we appreciate you as a person. Now you're one of us. So I learned through that experience valuable and enduring lessons about myself and about what it means to live in community. Now, I wish I could tell you that I always apply those lessons. I wish I could tell you that from that point on, it was as easy for me to receive as it is to give. But that wouldn't be honest, and I'll probably struggle with this for the rest of my life. A faulty notion of self-sufficiency seems to be one of my addictions. I think back, for example, I was having a conversation with a couple of friends just this past week about this. And this was only, well, it was while we were still living in Anaheim, where we were just before we moved here, and had to take Laura's car in for some repairs. And the place where we had to take the car was about 16 miles from our house. So I took the car in and had to leave it there. And rather than call anybody to get a ride, I ran home. Now, I love running, but 16 miles in my dress clothes was not exactly what I had in mind. So I still deal with this issue. But at least I recognize how faulty it is, and I'm trying to do something about it. And to the degree that any of you share that addiction with me, I'm urging you to do something about it as well. You see, when God created us, it was with a plan and a purpose. And an inherent part of that plan is our dependence upon one another. And I believe fundamentally that's what Jesus is getting at in this beatitude. Just read through the New Testament and see how often you come across the phrase one another. As followers of Jesus, we're exhorted to love one another, to instruct one another, to encourage one another, to spur one another on toward love and good deeds, to rejoice with one another, to weep with one another, to forgive one another, to bear with one another, to be devoted to one another, to live in harmony with one another, to confess our faults to one another, to pray for one another, to bear one another's burdens. It wouldn't be in there that often if it wasn't important. I heard about someone who proudly described himself as being a self-made man. Someone else said about him, "I know that man very well, and I think he should have called in some help." The fact is that none of us can do a good job of making it in this life on our own. So let's not be so prideful, so fearful, so stubborn, or so stupid not to ask for what we need. Ask for prayers. Ask for a ride. Ask for a listening ear. Ask for encouragement. Ask for a helping hand. Ask for friendship. Ask for forgiveness. Ask for correction. Ask for big things. Ask for little things. Ask for things that are somewhere in between. Ask for help with your physical needs. Ask for help with your emotional needs. Ask for help with your spiritual needs. And look for what's being offered to you even when you don't ask. Look and don't close yourself off from receiving. Whether we want to admit it or not, by our very nature, we are all among the joy in this world. We're all beggars. We're all dependent. But we're only blessed, we're only happy when we do admit that and turn our dependence into a source of strength. I told you that the Greek word for blessed or happy is makarios. The root word of that is mak, which means literally to have length. Probably the best English equivalent we have for that is the word big. And I like that. Suggests to me that it takes big people to take the big step of admitting need, receiving help, and as a result, being blessed in a big, big way. Let's you and I intentionally be among those people. Will you pray with me? God, we thank you for creating us the way you have, which has so many implications. But certainly one of the implications is that we are created to live in community. We are created to give and receive, to be needy and to be giving. Help us to remember that. Help us to practice that. Help us in doing so to be the people you have created us to be.